August 19th, 1944, 1400 hours, Falaise, France. The battlefield was chaos. Gunfire, explosions, screams, smoke choked the air. German Colonel Hans von Luck knew they were surrounded, his once proud unit reduced to a desperate handful. American Shermans advanced relentlessly, their engines roaring like an angry tide. Panzers lay burning, ammunition spent. Von Luck gripped his Luger, knuckles white. He had sworn to fight to the end, but now the end was here. The American noose had been tightening for days, ever since the Allies had broken out of Normandy. The Wehrmacht, once the terror of Europe, was in full retreat. The Falaise pocket, a cauldron of encircled German divisions, was the latest disaster. Von Luck's 21st Panzer Division, pride of the Afrika Corps, had been reduced to a shell. Fuel was scarce, ammunition scarcer. The roads were choked with burnt-out vehicles and desperate men. The sky belonged to the American Jabos, dive bombers that struck with impunity. In the distance, von Luck could see the spearheads of the American armored divisions, Shermans, hundreds of them, rolling forward like a steel tsunami. Their cannons flashed, shells screaming overhead to tear into the battered German lines. He had faced American tanks before, in the deserts of North Africa, but this was different. This was a flood, an unending torrent of men and machines. For every Panzer, the Americans seemed to have 10 Shermans. For every German soldier, 10 GIs. Von Luck's radio crackled. Urgent voices, pleading for orders, for reinforcements, for a miracle. He had none to give. The high command was silent, the lines to headquarters cut. The proud divisions of the Wehrmacht were left to die piecemeal, gnawed apart by American jaws. A runner stumbled into von Luck's command post, his face smeared with soot and blood. "Herr Oberst," he gasped, "the Americans have taken Hill 112. Hauptmann Müller is dead. The men, they're abandoning their positions." Von Luck clenched his jaw. Hill 112 had been their last bastion, their final hope to break the American stranglehold. Now, it was gone. He looked out over the battlefield, the smoke-shrouded valley that had become their tomb. Burning tanks, their hulls glowing like funeral pyres. Broken men stumbling in retreat. The once mighty Wehrmacht, reduced to this. In that moment, a cold realization settled over von Luck like a shroud. This was the end, not just of the battle, but of the war. Germany had unleashed a monster it could not tame. American industry, American manpower, American resolve, ISI, they had underestimated it all. The radio crackled again. An American voice, speaking clumsy German. "German forces, lay down your arms. Further resistance is futile. You are surrounded. Surrender now, and your lives will be spared." Von Luck closed his eyes. Surrender. The word tasted like ashes on his tongue. But what choice did they have? To fight on was suicide, a pointless sacrifice. Germany needed men like him to survive, to rebuild. He took a deep breath, the acrid tang of cordite filling his nostrils. Then, with a heavy heart, he gave the order he had never thought to give. "All units, this is Oberst von Luck. Cease firing, destroy your weapons. We are surrendering. May God forgive us." The words seemed to hang in the air, a final epitaph for the dreams of the Third Reich. Around him, the guns fell silent, the battle's roar fading to a hollow whisper. It was over. The Falaise pocket had become a mass grave for German ambitions, and as von Luck stepped out to meet his captors, hands raised in surrender, he knew that the war, his war, was lost. Little did he know that the true shock, the true scale of Germany's doom, was yet to be revealed. That revelation awaited him in the American camps, in the long rows of Sherman tanks that stretched to the horizon, in the staggering numbers that would tell the tale of a nation outmatched, outproduced, and outfought on every front. But for now, in this moment, all he felt was the weight of defeat, the bitter taste of a warrior's dream turned to ashes in his mouth. The dream of the Third Reich, the dream of German supremacy, lay shattered on the fields of Normandy. And Hans von Luck, the proud Panzer commander, was now just another prisoner, another trophy in the American war machine's relentless advance. August 19th, 1944, 1600 hours, an American POW camp near Falaise. The drone of engines filled the air as the convoy of captured Germans rolled into the hastily constructed enclosure. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, and rows of olive-drab tents stretched out before them, a stark contrast to the battlefields they had just left. Colonel Hans von Luck, his once immaculate uniform now stained with the grime of battle, stepped down from the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. Around him, his men, the remnants of the proud 21st Panzer Division, looked shell-shocked and exhausted. American MPs' rifles slung over their shoulders herded the Germans like cattle, barking orders in broken German. "Schnell, schnell, move it." Von Luck felt a surge of anger, the humiliation of defeat burning in his gut. But he held his tongue, knowing that resistance would only make things worse for his men. They were processed efficiently, their weapons and personal effects confiscated, their names and ranks recorded by bored-looking American clerks. Then they were led to the holding areas, vast fields of tents where thousands of Germans already sat in dejected silence. As von Luck walked through the camp, he couldn't help but marvel at the scale of the American operation. The logistics, the manpower, the sheer abundance of resources, it was staggering. American soldiers, well-fed and well-equipped, lounged around the perimeter, smoking cigarettes and swapping stories. Jeeps and trucks rumbled through the camp, ferrying supplies and personnel. In the distance, von Luck could hear the roar of aircraft engines, a constant reminder of American air superiority. It was a far cry from the German lines, where every bullet, every drop of fuel was precious. The Americans, it seemed, had resources to spare. Von Luck and his men were assigned to a tent, a canvas palace compared to the foxholes and bombed-out buildings they were used to. As they settled in, von Luck couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. The Americans were treating them well, far better than he had expected. There was food, water, even rudimentary medical care for the wounded. But beneath the veneer of civility, von Luck sensed something else, a quiet confidence, an assuredness of victory. It was in the eyes of the American guards, in the easy banter of the soldiers, in the very air of the camp. The Americans knew they were winning, and they knew that the Germans knew it too. As the day wore on, von Luck found himself in a makeshift officer's mess, sipping weak coffee and picking at a plate of sea rations. Around him, other German officers huddled in small groups, their voices low and their faces drawn. The talk was of the battle, of the friends and comrades lost, of the uncertain future that lay ahead. But always, the conversation would turn to the Americans, their strength, their resources, their seemingly inexhaustible supply of men and machines. "I heard they have factories that can produce a tank every hour," one officer whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How can we fight against that?" "We can't," another replied grimly. "We never could. We were fools to try." Von Luck listened in silence, his mind churning with the implications. Germany had always prided itself on the quality of its soldiers, on the brilliance of its tactics and strategies. But in the face of American industrial might, those things seemed suddenly insignificant. How could the bravest soldier, the cleverest general, hope to prevail against an enemy that could replace its losses faster than they could be inflicted? How could a nation of artisans and craftsmen compete with the mass production lines of Detroit and Pittsburgh? As the sun began to set over the POW camp, casting long shadows across the rows of tents, Hans von Luck felt a chill settle into his bones. It was the chill of realization, of a truth that he had long suspected but never fully acknowledged. Germany was doomed, not by any failure of its fighting men, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of American power. And as he sat there, A prisoner in a foreign land, von Luck knew that the war, for him and for his country, was all but over. He thought of the proud history of the German military, of the great victories and the legendary commanders. From Frederick the Great to Moltke, from Bismarck to Hindenburg, Germany had always been a nation of warriors, a land where martial prowess was prized above all else. But now, in the face of American industrial supremacy, that proud tradition seemed like a hollow boast. What good was tactical brilliance against an enemy who could drown you in steel and fire? What use was courage against a foe who could replace his fallen faster than you could count your own dead? As the lights began to flicker on across the POW camp, electric bulbs casting a harsh glow over the sea of tents, Hans von Luck closed his eyes, a bone-deep weariness settling over him like a shroud. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring new challenges, new humiliations, interrogations perhaps, or the long, dreary march into captivity. But for now, in this moment of quiet despair, all he could think of was the bitter taste of defeat and the looming spectre of a war that his nation could not hope to win. August 20th, 1944, 0800 hours, the American POW camp near Falaise. The morning sun cast a pale light over the rows of tents, the dew glistening on the canvas like 1,000 tiny mirrors. In the distance, the sound of reveille echoed across the camp, a harsh bugle call that shattered the early morning stillness. Colonel Hans von Luck emerged from his tent, his eyes squinting against the brightness. Around him, his men were stirring, their faces haggard and unshaven, their uniforms rumpled from a restless night on hard cots. The American guards were already in position, their rifles held at the ready, their eyes watchful for any sign of trouble. They seemed almost casual in their vigilance, as if the presence of thousands of German prisoners was merely a minor inconvenience. Von Luck joined the line for breakfast, a metal tray clutched in his hands. The food was simple but plentiful: boiled eggs, toast, coffee that was far stronger than anything he had tasted in months. It was a stark reminder of the plenty that seemed to flow so effortlessly in this land of their enemies. As he ate, von Luck's mind wandered to the events of the previous day, to the long, humiliating march into captivity. He thought of the looks on his men's faces, the mix of shock and despair that had been etched into every line and furrow. They had been so confident, so sure of their own superiority. The victories of the past had made them complacent, had blinded them to the true strength of their foes. And now, here they were, reduced to prisoners in a foreign land, their fate resting in the hands of their captors. A commotion at the edge of the camp caught von Luck's attention. A group of American officers had arrived, their jeeps kicking up clouds of dust as they rolled to a stop. The German prisoners watched warily, unsure of what this new development might mean. One of the officers, a tall, lanky man with a shock of red hair, approached von Luck, a clipboard in his hand. "Colonel Hans von Luck?" he asked, his voice carrying a faint southern drawl. Von Luck nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I am." The American consulted his clipboard. "You're to come with us, sir. There are some folks who want to have a word with you." Von Luck felt a flicker of unease. Interrogation, no doubt. The Americans would be eager to extract whatever information they could from a high-ranking German officer. He had heard stories of their methods, of the tricks and traps they used to break a man's will. But he had no choice. Refusing would only make things worse, for himself and for his men. With a curt nod, he fell into step beside the American officer, his boots crunching on the gravel. They walked in silence for a while, past the rows of tents and the clusters of prisoners. Von Luck could feel the eyes of his men upon him, could sense their fear and their desperate hope. They were looking to him for guidance, for some sign that their situation was not as hopeless as it seemed. But what could he tell them? What words of comfort could he offer when he himself was lost in a sea of doubt and uncertainty? The American led him to a large tent at the center of the camp, its canvas walls flapping gently in the breeze. Inside, A group of officers sat around a long table, their faces serious and their eyes sharp with intelligence. At the head of the table sat a man with the insignia of a general, his face lined with the weight of command. He looked up as von Luck entered, his gaze piercing and unwavering. "Colonel von Luck," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Please, have a seat. We have much to discuss." Von Luck sat, his heart pounding in his chest. The interrogation, it seemed, was about to begin, and as he looked into the eyes of his captors, he knew that the battle he now faced would be unlike any he had ever fought before. For this was not a battle of tanks and guns, of strategy and tactics. This was a battle of wits and wills, a struggle for the very soul of a nation. And as the first question was asked, Hans von Luck steeled himself for the fight of his life, knowing that the fate of Germany itself might well hang in the balance. August 20th, 1944, 1000 hours. The interrogation tent. The air inside the tent was stifling, the heat compounded by the tension that seemed to radiate from every man present. Colonel Hans von Luck sat ramrod straight in his chair, his face a mask of composure even as his mind raced with uncertainty. Across from him, the American general leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Colonel," he began, his voice calm and measured, "we have some questions for you, about the German war effort, about your forces' disposition and strength." Von Luck met the general's gaze unflinchingly. "I am a soldier of the Reich," he said, his voice steady. "I will not betray my country or my comrades." The general smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I expected nothing less," he said, "but I think you'll find that cooperation is in your best interest, and in the interest of your men." He nodded to one of the other officers, who produced a sheaf of papers from a folder. "These are reports from our intelligence services," the general continued. "Estimates of German troop strengths, of armament production, of fuel reserves. I think you'll find them illuminating." Von Luck took the papers, his eyes scanning the neat rows of numbers and statistics. As he read, he felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. The figures were staggering, painting a picture of American might that dwarfed anything Germany could hope to muster. Tanks, planes, ships dot in every category. The Americans outstripped the Reich by orders of magnitude. And the production numbers are God. The production numbers. Factories churning out weapons and vehicles at a rate that seemed scarcely possible, a torrent of steel and fire that could drown all of Europe in its fury. Von Luck looked up, his face ashen. This cannot be," he whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. "These numbers, they are a fantasy, a deception." The general shook his head. "I assure you, Colonel, they are quite real, and they represent only a fraction of our total capacity. The United States is a nation of limitless resources, of boundless ingenuity. We have only begun to tap the full measure of our strength." Von Luck felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the papers slipping from his numb fingers. He had known, on some level, that the Americans were powerful. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. This was a colossus, a behemoth that could crush Germany beneath its heel like an ant. The general was watching him closely, his eyes glinting with a hint of satisfaction. "You see now, don't you, Colonel?" he said softly. "The war is over. Germany has lost. It is only a matter of time before the final surrender." Von Luck shook his head, a last, desperate flicker of defiance. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, Germany will never surrender. We will fight to the last man, to the last bullet. We will never yield." The general sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. "Colonel," he said, his voice tinged with something like pity, "I admire your courage, your devotion to your country. But you must face facts. Germany is beaten. Your cities lie in ruins. Your armies are in retreat. And the worst is yet to come." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into von Luck's. The invasion of Germany itself is only a matter of months away, he said, his voice low and intense. And when that day comes, Colonel, the full might of American arms will be unleashed upon your homeland. Your cities will burn, your people will suffer, and all for a cause that is already lost. Von Luck felt a cold sweat break out on his brow, the words hitting him like physical blows. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that the Americans spoke the truth. Germany was doomed, her fate sealed by the inexorable gears of American industry. And as he sat there, the weight of that realization crashing down upon him like a physical force, Hans von Luck felt something break inside him, some last fragile thread of hope and delusion. For the first time, he saw the war for what it truly was, not a glorious crusade, but a monstrous folly, a road to ruin paved with the blood and bones of a generation. And in that moment, as the tears began to stream down his cheeks, the proud Panzer commander wept for his country, for the dream that had died in the fields of France. August 20th, 1944. 1300 hours. The American POW camp near Falaise. The sun was high overhead, beating down upon the rows of tents and the dusty paths that wound between them. Colonel Hans von Luck walked slowly, his feet heavy with the weight of revelation, his heart burdened by the knowledge of his country's impending doom. Around him, the camp bustled with activity, American soldiers going about their duties with the brisk efficiency that seemed to characterize everything they did. Trucks rumbled past, laden with supplies and equipment, while overhead, the constant drone of aircraft engines filled the sky. Von Luck paid them no heed, lost in his own thoughts, in the echoes of the conversation that still rang in his ears. The words of the American general, the cold, hard facts of Germany's plight, they had shaken him to his core, had stripped away the last vestiges of his illusions. He found himself wandering, his feet carrying him aimlessly through the camp. He passed groups of German prisoners, their faces drawn and haggard, their eyes dull with the knowledge of their own defeat. Some looked up as he passed, their gazes full of questions, of desperate hope for some word of comfort or guidance. But von Luck had none to give. What could he say to them, these men who had followed him into battle, who had trusted in his leadership and his courage? How could he tell them that it had all been for nothing, that their sacrifices had been in vain? He walked on, his mind whirling with images of the war, of the battles he had fought and the men he had lost. He thought of the early days, of the heady rush of victory as the Wehrmacht had swept across Europe like a tidal wave. He thought of the Russian steppes, of the bitter cold and the endless horizons, of the savage, desperate fighting that had raged for months on end. And he thought of the turning point, of the moment when the tide had begun to shift, when the endless resources and the indomitable will of the Allies had begun to tell. He remembered the first whispers of doubt, the first flickers of fear that had begun to spread through the ranks like a cancer. He had tried to stem the tide, to rally his men and lead them to victory. But it had been like trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. The Americans, the British, the Russians, they had come on in a relentless tide, their strength growing with every passing day. And now, here he was, a prisoner in a foreign land, his once proud division reduced to a ragged band of survivors. The war was lost, the dream of German victory shattered beyond repair. Von Luck's wanderings took him to the edge of the camp, to the barbed wire fence that marked the boundary of his confinement. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the rolling hills of Normandy, at the distant horizon that seemed to beckon with a cruel, taunting promise of freedom. And then he saw them. Tanks, American tanks, Sherman tanks, their hulls gleaming in the sunlight, their engines rumbling with the promise of power and destruction. They were lined up in neat rows, stretching out across the fields like some vast, invincible army. Von Luck felt his breath catch in his throat, his eyes widening with a mix of awe and horror. He had faced American tanks before, had fought them in the deserts of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy. But never had he seen so many. Never had he been confronted with such a tangible manifestation of American might. For a long moment he simply stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of what he was seeing. And then, as if moving of its own accord, his hand drifted to the iron cross that hung at his throat, the symbol of his own valor and sacrifice. But as his fingers closed around the cold metal, von Luck felt a sudden rush of shame, of bitter realization. For what good were valor and sacrifice in the face of such overwhelming power? What chance did the bravest soldier, the most skilled commander, have against an enemy that could field such an army of steel and fire? In that moment, as he stood there in the shadow of American might, Hans von Luck knew with a certainty that went beyond words that the war was truly lost, that the dream of German victory had been nothing more than a cruel and bitter illusion. And as the tears began to flow once more, the proud Panzer commander bowed his head in defeat, his spirit broken by the weight of the truth that had been revealed to him. August 21st, 1944, 0900 hours. The American POW camp near Falaise. The morning dawned grey and overcast, a fitting reflection of the mood that had settled over the camp like a pall. For Colonel Hans von Luck, the night had been a long and sleepless one, his mind haunted by visions of the war, of the suffering and destruction that had been unleashed upon the world. He emerged from his tent, his eyes bloodshot and his face lined with exhaustion. Around him, the camp was already stirring, the American guards taking up their posts, the German prisoners beginning their daily routines. But von Luck paid them no heed, his thoughts still consumed by the revelations of the previous day, by the shattering realization of Germany's impending defeat. He walked in a daze, his feet carrying him through the camp, his mind a whirlwind of despair and regret. He found himself drawn back to the edge of the camp, to the spot where he had stood the day before, gazing out at the rows of American tanks. They were still there, a silent, menacing presence that seemed to mock the feeble efforts of the German war machine. As he stared at them, von Luck felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger, a desire to lash out, to strike back at the enemy that had brought his country to its knees. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it for the futile gesture it was. For what could he do, a lone man against the might of an entire nation? What hope did Germany have when faced with an enemy that could produce such weapons in such numbers, that could field armies that dwarfed anything the Reich could muster? Von Luck's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see a group of American officers approaching, their faces grim and their eyes hard. At their head was the general who had interrogated him the day before, his expression one of barely concealed triumph. "Colonel von Luck," the general said, his voice cold and formal, "I trust you have had time to reflect on our conversation yesterday. Have you come to any conclusions?" Von Luck met the general's gaze, his own eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance and despair. "Only that Germany is doomed," he said, his voice harsh and bitter. "That we have been fools to challenge the might of the United States." The general nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "A hard truth, Colonel, but a necessary one, and one that your countrymen would do well to learn before it is too late." He gestured to the tanks behind him, their hulls gleaming in the pale morning light. "This is but a fraction of our strength," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, implacable confidence. "And we have only begun to tap the full potential of American industry. Even now, our factories are working around the clock, producing the weapons that will bring about Germany's final defeat." Von Luck said nothing, his gaze fixed on the tanks, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they represented. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a proud, broken man in the face of an implacable foe. And then, as if by some unspoken signal, the American officers turned and walked away, leaving von Luck alone with his thoughts and his despair. He stood there for a long time, his eyes staring sightlessly at the rows of tanks, his mind spinning with visions of the future, of the devastation that was to come. And, as the minutes ticked by, he felt a sense of resignation settle over him, a grim acceptance of the inevitable. For he knew now that there could be no victory for Germany, no escape from the fate that awaited her. The war was lost, the die was cast, and all that remained was the bitter endgame, the final, futile struggle against the inexorable march of history. And as he turned to walk back into the camp, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed, Hans von Luck knew that he would carry the weight of that knowledge with him for the rest of his days, a burden that would haunt him until the end of his life. For in that moment he had seen the future, and it was a future that belonged to the United States, to the nation that had harnessed the power of industry and technology to create a military machine that was beyond anything the world had ever seen. And, in the face of that machine, the once mighty Wehrmacht was nothing more than a paper tiger, a relic of a bygone age, doomed to be swept aside by the tides of history. August 22nd, 1944, 1400 hours, a temporary Allied headquarters near Falaise. The room was large and airy, with high ceilings and windows that let in the pale afternoon light. Around a massive oak table sat a group of men in uniform, their faces grave and their eyes fixed on the figure at the head of the table. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, leaned forward in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and measured, "I have called you here today to discuss the implications of our recent victories and to plan our next moves in the campaign against Germany." There was a murmur of assent from around the table, a sense of anticipation and excitement that was palpable in the air. For these men knew that they were on the cusp of history, that the decisions they made in this room would shape the course of the war and the fate of nations. Eisenhower turned to one of his aides, a young captain with a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Captain, if you would be so kind as to summarize the latest intelligence reports." The captain nodded, clearing his throat nervously. "Yes, sir. Our sources indicate that the German war machine is in a state of collapse. Their armies are in full retreat, their supplies are dwindling, and their morale is at an all-time low. The recent Allied breakthroughs in Normandy and the south of France have dealt them a blow from which they may never recover." Eisenhower nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "And what of their industrial capacity, their ability to produce new weapons and equipment?" The captain consulted his notes. "Severely diminished, sir. Our bombing campaigns have wreaked havoc on their factories and infrastructure. They are struggling to keep up with the demand for new tanks, planes, and other armaments. By our estimates, their production levels have dropped by more than 60% in the last year alone." There was a murmur of approval from around the table, a sense of grim satisfaction at the news of the enemy's weakening state. But Eisenhower's face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the young captain. "And what of our own strength?" he asked, his voice quiet but intense. "What is the state of our forces, our supplies, our morale?" The captain smiled, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "Never better, sir. Our men are well equipped, well fed, and eager for the fight. Our supply lines are strong, our factories are working around the clock, and our people back home are united in their support for the war effort. We have never been in a better position to strike the final blow against Germany." Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the walls of the room. "The final blow," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper. "The end of the war, the liberation of Europe, the triumph of freedom over tyranny. It is within our grasp, gentlemen. But we must not let our guard down, not even for a moment. The Germans are a proud and stubborn people, and they will fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last drop of blood." He turned to the officers around the table, his gaze hard and unwavering. "That is why we must press our advantage, why we must strike now, while the iron is hot. We have the men, the weapons, the will to win. Let us use them let us unleash the full might of American arms upon the enemy, until they have no choice but to surrender or be destroyed." There was a chorus of agreement from around the table, a sense of determination and resolve that filled the room like a tangible presence. And as the meeting began to break up, as the officers rose to go about their duties, there was a sense of purpose in their step, a fire in their eyes that spoke of the battles to come. For they knew that they were the instruments of history, the men upon whose shoulders rested the fate of the free world. And they would not rest, they would not falter, until the job was done, and the Nazi menace was wiped from the face of the earth. And somewhere, in a POW camp not far from that room, a German colonel named Hans von Luck sat in his tent, his head in his hands, as the weight of that inexorable truth bore down upon him like a mountain of stone. September 15th, 1944, 1000 hours, the American POW camp near Falaise. The days had turned into weeks, the weeks into a month. For Colonel Hans von Luck, time seemed to have lost all meaning, each day blurring into the next in an endless procession of dull, grey monotony. He sat in his tent, his once proud uniform now faded and worn, his eyes staring sightlessly at the canvas walls. Around him, the camp bustled with activity, the sound of American voices and the rumble of trucks, a constant backdrop to his solitude. But von Luck hardly noticed, his mind lost in a haze of despair and regret. The revelations of that fateful day, the sight of those American tanks stretching out across the horizon, had shattered something inside him, had stripped away the last vestiges of his hope and his pride. He had tried to rally, to find some sense of purpose in his captivity. He had spoken to his men, had tried to keep their spirits up, to remind them of their duty and their honour. But even as he spoke the words, he could hear the hollowness in his own voice, could feel the emptiness in his own heart. For what was duty, what was honour, in the face of such overwhelming odds? What purpose could there be, when the very foundations of one's world had been swept away, when the dream of victory had been replaced by the certainty of defeat? Von Luck had seen the signs, had read the reports that filtered into the camp from the outside world. The Allied armies were on the move, sweeping across France and Belgium, driving the once mighty Wehrmacht before them like leaves before a storm. Paris had fallen, Antwerp had been liberated, and the German frontier itself was now within reach. And everywhere the story was the same, of American might and German weakness, of a nation that had once sought to conquer the world, now struggling to hold on to its own soil. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, its planes grounded for lack of fuel and parts. The Kriegsmarine was a fleet in name only, its ships sunk or scattered, its U-boats hunted to extinction. And the once proud Panzer divisions, the spearhead of the German war machine, were now little more than scrap metal, their tanks abandoned or destroyed, their crews dead or captured. Von Luck had seen it all, had heard the stories from the newly arrived prisoners, the tales of defeat and despair that echoed his own. And with each passing day, each new report of German losses and American gains, he felt the weight of that despair grow heavier, felt the burden of his own helplessness press down upon him like a physical force. For what could he do, a prisoner in a foreign land, his fate and the fate of his country now in the hands of others? What hope was there, when the very foundations of the German war effort had been so thoroughly undermined, when the industrial might of the United States had been brought to bear with such devastating effect? Von Luck had no answers, no solutions to the questions that plagued his mind. All he had was the bitter knowledge of his own failure, the gnawing awareness that he had been part of a machine that had brought ruin and destruction to the world, and that was now itself being ground into dust by the inexorable gears of history. And so he sat, day after day, his mind drifting through the wreckage of his own memories, the ghosts of his fallen comrades, and the spectre of his own defeat, his only companions. The Iron Cross that had once been his proudest possession now seemed like a mockery, a symbol of a cause that had been lost long before he had ever set foot on the beaches of Normandy. For in the end, what had it all been for? The sacrifices, the suffering, the endless years of war and bloodshed? What had been gained, what had been achieved, that could justify the price that had been paid? As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Hans von Luck could find no answer to those questions, no solace in the bitter knowledge of his own captivity. And so he sat, a once proud warrior reduced to a shell of a man, waiting for the end of a war that had already been lost, and the judgment of a world that had passed him by. October 5th, 1944, 1400 hours, the American POW camp near Falaise. The autumn wind whipped through the camp, carrying with it the first hints of the coming winter. The leaves on the trees had turned to gold and crimson, a final, fleeting burst of colour before the bleakness of the months ahead. For Colonel Hans von Luck, the changing of the seasons brought little comfort, little respite from the endless cycle of his own thoughts. He had been in the camp for months now, his days blurring together in a haze of boredom and despair, his nights haunted by dreams of the war and the men he had lost. But on this day, as he sat in his tent, his eyes staring sightlessly at the canvas walls, something new intruded upon his solitude, a sound, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. The sound of engines, of wheels on gravel, of voices raised in excitement and anticipation. Von Luck rose to his feet, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He stepped outside, blinking in the bright October sunlight, and saw a sight that made his heart skip a beat. Tanks, American tanks, Shermans, their hulls gleaming in the sun, their engines rumbling with barely contained power. They were rolling into the camp, one after another, a seemingly endless procession of armoured might. But it was not just the tanks that caught von Luck's eye, not just the sight of that rolling wall of steel that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the men who rode upon them, the American soldiers, with their easy smiles and their confident swagger, the men who had come to symbolize everything that Germany had come to fear and despise. They were young, these men, their faces still smooth and unlined, their eyes bright with the promise of victory. They lounged on the hulls of their tanks, their weapons held casually at their sides, their laughter and their jokes echoing across the camp like a reminder of their own invincibility. And as von Luck watched them, as he saw the ease with which they moved and the confidence with which they carried themselves, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of his own insignificance, of the utter futility of the cause for which he had fought and suffered. For what could Germany do in the face of such power and such assurance? What hope did the Reich have when confronted by an enemy that could field such weapons and such men, that could call upon the resources of an entire continent in its quest for victory? Von Luck had seen the evidence of that power, had heard the rumours and the reports that filtered through the camp grapevine. The Americans, it was said, had more tanks than Germany had ever produced, more planes than the Luftwaffe had ever flown. They had the wealth of a nation behind them, the industrial might of a people united in their determination to win. And against that might, against that inexorable tide of men and machines, what chance did Germany have? What hope was there for a nation that had staked its very existence on the dream of conquest, only to find itself outmatched and outfought at every turn? As the tanks rolled past, their engines roaring and their treads churning up the muddy ground, von Luck felt a sense of resignation wash over him, a grim acceptance of the fate that awaited his country. For he knew, with a certainty that went beyond mere knowledge, that the war was lost, that the dream of the Third Reich was dead and buried. And with that realization came a sense of relief, a strange, almost perverse sense of liberation. For what was left when the illusions had been stripped away and the lies had been exposed? What remained when the facade of invincibility had been shattered and the true face of the enemy had been revealed? Only the truth, cold and hard and unforgiving. The truth of Germany's weakness and America's strength, of the folly of a nation that had sought to conquer the world and had instead been brought to its knees. And as Hans von Luck stood there, watching the tanks roll by in a never-ending stream of steel and firepower, he knew that he would carry that truth with him for the rest of his days, a burden and a blessing all at once. For in the end, what else was left but to face the reality of one's own defeat, and to find in that defeat the seeds of a new beginning, a new understanding of the world and one's place within it. November 11th, 1944, 1100 hours. The streets of Falaise, France. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent, the armies had laid down their arms, and the world had begun the slow, painful process of rebuilding from the ashes of conflict. For Colonel Hans von Luck, the end had come not with a bang, but with a whimper. He had been in the camp when the news had arrived, a terse announcement over the loudspeakers that had sent a ripple of shock and disbelief through the ranks of the German prisoners. Germany had surrendered, the Reich had fallen, the dream of conquest and glory had been shattered, and the once proud nation had been brought to its knees by the combined might of the Allied powers. For von Luck, the news had been a bitter pill to swallow, a final, crushing blow to a spirit that had already been tested to its limits. He had listened in silence as the announcement was made, his eyes closed and his head bowed, a man broken by the weight of his own defeat. In the days that followed, as the camp had emptied and the prisoners had been sent home to a country that no longer existed, von Luck had wandered the streets of Falaise like a ghost, his mind numb and his heart heavy with the burden of his own failures. He had seen the destruction that the war had wrought, the shattered buildings and the ruined lives that had been left in its wake. He had seen the faces of the French people, the anger and the hatred that had been born of years of occupation and oppression, and he had seen the American soldiers, the young men who had come across an ocean to fight and die for a cause that was not their own. He had watched them as they moved through the streets, their faces flushed with the joy of victory and the relief of survival, their laughter and their tears mingling with the sounds of a town slowly coming back to life. For von Luck, those sights and sounds had been a reminder of all that had been lost, of the dreams that had been shattered, and the lives that had been wasted in the pursuit of a false and empty glory. He had thought back to the days of the war, to the battles and the campaigns that had consumed so much of his life, and he had felt a sense of bitter regret, a gnawing awareness of his own complicity in the suffering that had been unleashed upon the world. But even in the midst of that regret, even in the depths of his own despair, von Luck had found a glimmer of hope, a faint and flickering light that had begun to shine through the darkness of his own defeat. For he had seen, in the faces of the American soldiers and the French civilians, a resilience and a strength that had been forged in the crucible of war. He had seen the determination and the courage that had sustained them through the long years of conflict, the unbreakable spirit that had carried them through to victory. And in that spirit, in that unwavering commitment to the ideals of freedom and justice, von Luck had found a measure of redemption, a sense of purpose that had been lacking in his own life for so long. He had made a vow then, as he walked the streets of Falaise and watched the world begin to heal from the wounds of war. He had sworn to himself that he would dedicate his life to the cause of peace, to the task of building a world in which the horrors of the past would never be repeated. It was a vow that he would keep in the years that followed, as he worked to rebuild his shattered country and to forge a new understanding between the nations that had once been enemies. It was a vow that would sustain him through the trials and the challenges that lay ahead, a beacon of hope in a world that had been forever changed by the fires of war. And as he walked those streets, his head held high and his eyes fixed on the horizon, Hans von Luck knew that he had found his true calling, his true purpose in life. For, in the end, what greater glory could there be than to work for the betterment of all mankind, and to strive for a world in which the sacrifices of the past would not have been made in vain,